Thomas Reed didn't raise his voice. In the middle of the executive meeting, while performance charts still glowed across the screens, he cut across my sentence and said, "We're moving in a different direction. HR will walk you out. No warning, no review, no explanation." The words landed clean and final, like a decision approved somewhere I had never been allowed to enter. A breath later, HR stepped in from the side of the room, tablet ready, eyes carefully neutral, as if this were a routine process instead of a public execution. I stayed seated. "Before I go," I said, evenly, "who's assuming responsibility for the operating system rollout?" Thomas didn't hesitate. He didn't even look at me. "That's replaceable." He replied, then, softer, for the room to hear, "You are." The silence that followed wasn't shock. It was relief. Relief that the blade hadn't landed on anyone else. I'd spent years running operations through outages, audits, vendor collapses, and regulatory pivots that nearly tore the company apart. I kept things alive while others chased credit. I fixed what broke quietly. Because systems don't reward ego. They reward discipline. That discipline had never impressed Thomas Reed. He'd arrived as the new CEO with polished language and aggressive timelines. Everything was about efficiency, velocity, cutting legacy weight. Context annoyed him. History bored him. People who didn't advertise their value made him uncomfortable. I stood and faced him. "Just so we're clear," I said, calm enough to surprise myself. "Nothing I built leaves with me." Thomas smiled, thin and confident. "We'll manage," he said. HR gestured toward the exit. I nodded once and followed, my badge still warm in my hand, my pulse steady. Anger would come later. Right now, control mattered more. Halfway down the hall, my phone vibrated. No severance details, no follow-up from HR, just a system alert. Board meeting moved up, mandatory attendance. I stopped walking. For the first time since Thomas spoke. Something before this goes any further. Take a small pause and sip a little warm water if you have it nearby. It's a simple habit, but it helps your body reset and keeps you grounded while you listen. Tell me where you're listening from. And if this story is speaking to you, consider subscribing so you can stay with me through what comes next. Because that hallway moment wasn't the end, it was where the balance started to shift. When the room finally cleared. The silence didn't feel like relief. It felt like compression, like everything I'd held in for years tightening at once. I walked without direction, replaying moments Thomas Reed would never put on a slide. I remembered nights when alerts stacked faster than we could clear them, when regulators called before dawn, when vendors folded mid-contract and left holes no one else knew how to patch. I stayed. I rerouted systems, rewrote processes, negotiated time we didn't technically have. The company didn't collapse because I made sure it couldn't afford to. I never showed up on stage for that work. I didn't accept spotlight bonuses or glossy praise emails. I believed operations should be invisible when done right. If everything runs, no one asks who kept it that way. That belief shaped how I worked and, eventually, how I disappeared. Thomas Reed never understood that logic. He trusted dashboards, slides, and metrics trimmed to fit a quarterly narrative. If something couldn't be summarized in 3 bullets, he treated it as excess weight. He called it efficiency. I called it amnesia in meetings. He praised bold moves and fast cuts. He liked clean charts more than messy realities. When someone asked about long-term risk, he waved it away with a confident smile. "We'll manage," he said often, as if repetition could replace preparation. The announcement came later that afternoon. Thomas told leadership we were cleaning house, removing legacy friction, simplifying accountability. The language was polished, rehearsed, and hollow. I wasn't named, but everyone knew. I had become an example without being allowed a defense. What stung wasn't the loss of title. It was the implication that my work had been ornamental, optional, something that could be stripped away without consequence. Years of restraint suddenly felt like a mistake. Silence, I realized, doesn't always read as strength. Sometimes it's mistaken for absence. I thought about the systems no one questioned because they never failed, the routines that prevented panic rather than reacting to it. I thought about how often I chose restraint over recognition, how many times I swallowed frustration to keep momentum intact. Thomas called that invisible. To me, it was discipline. Being told it was disposable felt like having my name erased from my own work, as if endurance itself were a flaw instead of a skill earned the hard way. That realization sat heavily, sharpening the bitterness while forcing me to confront how quietly I had allowed my value to be misunderstood for years. I checked my phone out of habit, expecting logistics, paperwork, closure. Instead, there was a system email I hadn't triggered. Automatic, legal, brief. Representation status remains active. I read it twice, then a third time. Slower. Whatever Thomas believed about replaceability, something else in this company still knew exactly who I was. When I didn't return to my office, no one seemed surprised. That was part of the advantage of never being loud. Instead, I showed up where it mattered, seated quietly at the long board table, badge inactive, posture neutral, listening. Thomas Reed looked relaxed. He spoke first, confident, measured, as if the last decision had already been validated somewhere beyond challenge. "We've aligned on a cleaner structure," he said, tapping a slide none of us needed to see. "The board supports decisive leadership." I watched faces instead of charts. Some nodded, some avoided eye contact. No one questioned the pace. Momentum has a way of impersonating consensus. A man I hadn't met before took a seat near the end of the table. He introduced himself with a single sentence, no resume, no emphasis. "I'm here on behalf of our client," he said. The tone was flat, professional, almost forgettable. Thomas barely acknowledged him. He continued outlining priorities, timelines, and cost savings, using words like agility and simplification. He spoke the language of certainty, the kind that doesn't invite interruption, when the chair asked if there were objections. Thomas smiled and said, "I think we're aligned." I stayed still. Control doesn't require motion. It requires timing. The lawyer adjusted his folder, not rushing, not apologizing. "Before you proceed," he said evenly, "we need to clarify representation." His voice didn't rise, but the room shifted anyway. Chairs stopped moving, pens paused. Thomas exhaled, impatient. "Legal can follow up offline," he replied, already turning back to the agenda. The lawyer didn't argue. He didn't explain. He simply finished the sentence he had started. "We represent the controlling shareholder." No one spoke. The word controlling settled differently than expected, heavier than ownership, more precise than influence. Thomas turned, eyebrows tightening, searching the table for a name that wasn't there. I met his glance briefly, then looked back down. This wasn't my moment to speak. Silence, used correctly, sharpens attention. The chair asked for clarification. The lawyer nodded once. Until representation is acknowledged, certain votes cannot proceed. Thomas straightened in his seat, confidence recalibrating into calculation. "That's not on the agenda," he said. "Nevertheless," the lawyer replied, calm, unchanged. "It's binding." I felt something steady lock into place. No satisfaction, no triumph, just alignment. The system was doing exactly what it had been designed to do, without my intervention, without my voice. As the room absorbed the pause, I understood why I had never needed to speak before. When structure is sound, words become optional. I remained seated, breathing slow, letting the pause do its work. Control felt quiet, almost invisible, but firm. Nothing needed correcting yet. The board would ask questions soon. When they did, answers would arrive without emotion, on schedule, supported by rules already in place and respected by everyone present there. When the lawyer finished speaking, the room shifted from certainty into calculation. Thomas Reed leaned forward immediately and asked for the shareholder list, his tone sharp now, managerial, trying to reassert momentum. The screen refreshed, names appeared, funds, trusts, entities, no Logan Price. Thomas exhaled through his nose and smiled, thin and satisfied. "There it is," he said, tapping the table. "He's an employee. Nothing more." A few heads nodded, relieved by something familiar. I stayed silent, watching relief turn into overconfidence. The absence of my name felt intentional, almost elegant. Structure has a way of hiding strength when it's built correctly. The chair frowned. "If that's the case," she said, "why are we being told there's a controlling shareholder?" Thomas shrugged, spreading his hands. "Legal theatrics," he replied. "Someone trying to slow progress." He looked directly at me then. Dismissive. "We've already moved on." The lawyer didn't interrupt. He waited until Thomas finished performing certainty. Then he slid a single document forward. "Untouched. The list you're viewing reflects beneficial ownership," he said calmly, "not voting authority." That distinction landed unevenly. Some board members leaned closer, others stiffened, sensing the ground move without knowing why. Thomas frowned. "Those are the same thing," he said. "No," the lawyer replied, not correcting the tone, just the fact. "They are not." The chair asked for clarification. Her voice was controlled, but something underneath it had shifted. "Explain," she said. Before the lawyer could respond, Thomas cut in again, irritation breaking through. "This is unnecessary," he said. "We know who owns what." The lawyer turned slightly, addressing the room instead of Thomas. "Certain shares are held through a voting proxy structure," he said. "Activation depends on representation, not disclosure." Silence stretched. I could feel confusion ripple outward, quiet but contagious. Control doesn't vanish loudly. It slips. Thomas sat back, recalculating. "So you're saying he's hiding ownership," I'm saying, the lawyer replied, "that the right to vote does not require public identification." The chair looked from the lawyer to me, then back again. "Is that representation currently active?" she asked. The lawyer nodded once. "It is." Thomas laughed, short and forced. "Then prove it," he said. The lawyer met his gaze. "We request confirmation of voting representation before proceeding." The room stalled. Agendas stopped mattering. Slides froze. I remained quiet, watching certainty erode into doubt, and doubt into something far more dangerous: loss of control. Nobody objected. Nobody approved. The pause stretched long enough to expose fear behind authority. Thomas checked the screen again, as if repetition could summon certainty. I understood then that power wasn't being taken, it was being revealed, and revelation, once begun, doesn't ask permission. The next part may change the way you view the whole story. When the lawyer began explaining, the air in the room tightened. He didn't lecture or dramatize. He outlined facts the way courts prefer them: plain, structured, and difficult to argue with. He explained that 74% of the company's shares were held through a lawful trust arrangement, designed years earlier for continuity and protection. Those shares existed independently of employment status. Termination, promotion, or demotion did not affect ownership. That point landed first, heavy and unavoidable. Then he moved to authority. "Voting rights," he said, "were executed through a proxy structure. The trust named one individual with exclusive power to act on its behalf. That authority was documented, current, and enforceable." I felt the room lean forward without realizing it. Thomas Reed reacted immediately. He called it manipulation. He said it sounded like concealment, like someone gaming the system to retain leverage. His voice sharpened, searching for moral ground instead of legal footing. "If this was legitimate," he said, "it wouldn't be hidden." The lawyer didn't flinch. "It isn't hidden," he replied. "It's structured." He clarified that disclosure requirements had been met exactly as required. Nothing more, nothing less. The law didn't reward curiosity, it enforced compliance. Silence followed, thick with calculation. Thomas turned toward me then, eyes narrowed. "So you kept this quiet," he said. "You let everyone believe you were just an employee." I met his gaze calmly. "I let the system work," I said. "You chose not to ask. The distinction mattered. I hadn't misrepresented anything. I hadn't advertised it either. Power doesn't need introduction when it's documented correctly." The lawyer resumed, reminding the board that removing me from my role had no bearing on voting authority. Ownership remained intact, representation remained active. Decisions made without acknowledgement of that authority risked invalidation. Pressure settled across the table. This wasn't a debate anymore, it was exposure. Thomas leaned back, recalibrating, his earlier certainty replaced by something defensive. "This is obstruction," he said. "You're slowing progress." "No," the lawyer replied evenly. "We're preventing error." He then turned to me, finally breaking the pattern. "Mr. Price," he asked, "do you wish to identify yourself now?" Every eye shifted. The board waited. Thomas held still, caught between denial and realization. I didn't rush. Control doesn't demand speed. It demands accuracy. And in that moment, the structure I had trusted quietly for years stood ready, requiring only acknowledgement to complete the reversal already underway. I felt no triumph, only pressure easing into clarity. The rules hadn't changed, they had simply been ignored until now. Around the table, people shifted, recalculating loyalty, risk, and consequence. Thomas watched that shift happen, powerless to stop it, for the first time. The future was no longer his presentation to control. It belonged to structure, patience, and timing. I had trusted long before this meeting finally revealed itself, when the lawyer's question settled in the air. I stood, not abruptly, not to claim space, but because sitting no longer made sense. I didn't straighten my jacket or raise my voice. I didn't need to. Authority doesn't announce itself when the room is already listening. "Yes," I said. One word, no title, no explanation. The silence that followed wasn't confusion. It was impact. Chairs didn't move, screens didn't refresh. Even Thomas Reed stayed still, eyes fixed, as if motion might worsen whatever he had just realized. I remained standing, hands relaxed at my sides. I didn't look at Thomas. I looked at the table, at the documents that had always mattered more than opinions. The weight in the room wasn't anger or triumph. It was recognition arriving late. Thomas finally spoke, though his voice lacked the certainty it once carried. "You," he asked, as if proximity could rewrite reality. "You're saying you're the controlling shareholder, I'm saying," I replied calmly, "that I'm the one authorized to act. Nothing more. Anything else would have sounded like boasting. Around us, people process the difference between power they assumed and power they never bothered to verify." Thomas sank back slightly, his expression tightening. In that moment, it became clear he had built his authority on an incomplete picture. He had reviewed slides, metrics, and summaries, but never ownership, never structure. He had made decisions as if control were automatic, as if leadership itself created legitimacy. It didn't. What unsettled him most wasn't that I held the authority. It was that he had never known who did. He had shaken hands with investors, spoken to analysts, negotiated partnerships. And yet the owner of the company had been sitting in meetings he dismissed, running systems he barely noticed, and he had fired that person. The CFO cleared his throat, glancing down at the voting matrix displayed on his tablet. "Based on current representation," he said carefully, "the executive voting threshold is no longer met." Thomas turned sharply. "What does that mean it means?" the CFO continued, voice steady. "There aren't enough votes for you to continue acting unilaterally." The words landed with finality, not dramatic, not cruel, procedural. Thomas looked around the room, searching for support that had already recalculated itself. No one met his eyes. I understood then that collapse doesn't always arrive as chaos. Sometimes it comes as silence, as awareness settling into every corner at once. I sat back down, breathing evenly. The room remained frozen, not because anyone had lost control, but because it had finally become clear who never truly had it. Thomas leaned forward, lowering his voice, as if volume had been the mistake all along. "Let's reset," he said. "We moved too fast. That happens." I stayed seated, hands folded, listening. "You can come back," he continued. "We'll restore your role, senior title, expanded scope. You'll have more autonomy than before." His words began to stack, each one reaching for leverage, equity refresh, compensation adjustment, whatever it takes to put this behind us. Behind us. As if this were a scheduling error, not a public execution followed by structural collapse. I watched him closely. The confidence was gone, replaced by urgency disguised as reason. This wasn't leadership. It was survival instinct. "I appreciate the offer," I said, keeping my tone level, but no. The word landed harder than anything he'd said. Thomas frowned. "Think about it," he replied. "This doesn't need to get complicated. It already is." I answered, not sharply, just accurately. He tried again. "You know the company. You built half of what keeps it running. Walk away now and you risk destabilizing everything you care about." There it was. The appeal to responsibility. The same weight he'd dismissed as replaceable hours earlier. "I care about the company," I said. "That's why this can't be personal." Thomas exhaled, rubbing his hands together. "Then tell us what you want." That question shifted the room. Everyone leaned in. They expected terms, conditions, maybe a demand. They expected me to ask for control. I didn't. "There's another option," I said, meeting his eyes for the first time since he'd made his offer. "One that doesn't involve me returning." Confusion flickered across his face. "Go on. We sell," I said simply. "Orderly, clean, no disruption to staff. Systems stay intact, clients unaffected." The chair straightened. The CFO looked up. Thomas froze. "You can't be serious," Thomas said. "I am," I replied. "This company deserves leadership that understands what it's built on, not one that mistakes silence for absence." His voice rose despite himself. "You'd burn everything down because of one decision." I shook my head. "I'm preventing that." The room absorbed the shift. This wasn't revenge. It was resolution. Thomas looked around. Searching for resistance, he found calculation instead. For the first time, he understood that the ground had moved beyond him. Selling the company wasn't an escape. It was a conclusion. And in that moment, his last attempt to regain control collapsed into the realization that the choice no longer belonged to him at all. I made it clear from the start that I wasn't interested in the CEO chair. Titles distort judgment, and I had no intention of becoming the symbol Thomas had already proven himself unfit to carry. I outlined my conditions calmly. Without theatrics, every employee stays. No silent layoffs, no symbolic cuts to satisfy egos. The people who carried the company through instability would not pay for leadership failure. Second, the systems remain intact. No rushed migrations, no vanity restructures. Stability mattered more than appearances. Third, leadership changes end at the top. The CEO role and board composition would change, nothing else. The room listened differently this time, not defensively, not politically, but with the quiet focus that comes when options disappear. This wasn't a negotiation between equals. It was damage control guided by rules already in place. The chair asked whether I planned to remain involved after the sale. No. I answered, oversight during transition only. Then I step away. There was no bitterness in it, just closure. Someone asked if this was personal. I shook my head. If it were personal, this would look very different. That truth settled quickly. Revenge demands spectacle. This required precision. The board recessed briefly, though everyone knew the outcome, without my approval. Nothing moved. With it, the company survived intact. That math didn't need debate. When they returned, acceptance came quietly, conditions approved, timelines drafted, legal steps initiated, no applause, no relief, just procedure reclaiming control. One detail became clear as logistics took shape. Thomas Reed wasn't part of any discussion. His name didn't appear on invitations. His input wasn't requested. He had moved from decision maker to subject without ceremony. I didn't ask for that. I didn't need to. Authority rearranges rooms without announcing itself. As the meeting concluded, I felt no satisfaction, only balance restored. The company would continue, people would keep their jobs, systems would keep running, leadership would change without collateral damage, walking away from the table. I understood something important. Justice doesn't always raise its voice. Sometimes it simply removes the person who shouldn't have been speaking at all. It felt adult in the quiet way responsibility often does. No cheers, no victory laps, just an outcome that protected more people than it punished. That mattered to me. Power exercised loudly invites resistance. Power exercised correctly leaves nothing to argue with by the time documents circulated and calendars adjusted. The story had already ended for Thomas, not with drama, but with absence. He would read about decisions he no longer shaped, results he could no longer claim. That, I realized, was consequence enough. It closed the chapter cleanly, leaving the company steady and the lesson unmistakable for anyone still watching closely from inside there. When it finally happened, there was no confrontation, no raised voices, no dramatic escort. Thomas Reed was removed using the same procedure he had insisted on months earlier, the one he called clean, objective, and efficient. It arrived as an email, short subject line, standard language, termination effective immediately, access revoked. A calendar invitation quietly canceled, one signature at the bottom, legally sufficient, emotionally indifferent. I wasn't in the room when he read it. I didn't need to be. Justice doesn't require witnesses when the process is sound. What struck me was how familiar the rhythm felt. This was exactly how decisions had been delivered under his leadership. Fast, detached, designed to minimize discussion. He had believed that distance made actions professional. Now it simply made them final. There were no protests, no appeals. The board followed protocol. Legal confirmed compliance. IT executed the checklist. Everything moved the way it always had, only this time without his approval. I watched the sequence unfold from a removed distance, noting the irony without enjoying it. He had called roles replaceable. He had reduced people to functions. In the end, the system treated him the same way. HR sent the confirmation last as she reviewed the documentation. I saw the moment recognition reached her eyes. The framework, the language, the approval chain. She looked up at me, cautious now, almost unsettled. "You signed off on this," she said quietly. It wasn't an accusation, it was a realization. "Yes," I replied, years ago, back then. I'd approved the policy to prevent chaos, to ensure fairness, to remove emotion from decisions that could easily spiral. Thomas had embraced it enthusiastically, never asking who had built the guardrails he relied on. Now those guardrails had closed behind him. There was no satisfaction in it, only symmetry. The system hadn't betrayed him, it had followed him, step by step, exactly as designed. By the time the email chain ended, his name was already being replaced in templates and directories. No announcement followed, no explanation was owed. The company didn't pause to mourn authority it no longer needed. I closed my laptop and stood, not to leave in triumph, but because the process was complete. The man who called others disposable had been processed himself, quietly, efficiently, and without ceremony. Replaceable, it turned out, was never about skill. It was about misunderstanding where control truly lived. Thomas had mistaken position for power. The system knew better. It always had. People would move on, systems would stabilize, and his departure would become a footnote. That was the final irony after all his certainty. The company absorbed his absence without effort, delay, or disruption at all. I left the company operating exactly as it had the day before. Stable, staffed, and quietly efficient. That mattered more to me than any title I could have kept. I didn't return to manage. I didn't sit in the new CEO's chair or advise from behind the scenes. My role ended where it should have, at the point where the structure could stand without me. The systems continued to run, clients were unaffected, and employees kept their jobs. Stability became the outcome, not revenge, in the weeks that followed. Reports came in the way they always had. Metrics held, operations flowed, problems were handled before they became crises. The company absorbed change without collapse, which told me everything I needed to know. What I built wasn't fragile. It didn't depend on my presence, only on the discipline I had put into it. There's a quiet misconception that silence equals weakness, that if you aren't visible, you aren't valuable. I had lived under that assumption long enough to see its flaw. Strength doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it organizes, documents, and waits. Systems remember things people forget. They remember who designed the safeguards, who anticipated failure, who chose restraint over recognition. Long after names are removed from org charts, that memory remains embedded in process and policy. Walking away felt lighter than I expected, not because I had won, but because nothing had been lost. Justice didn't require spectacle, it required balance. The company moved forward without erasing the work that made it viable. That was enough. I didn't need an apology. I didn't need vindication. The outcome spoke clearly, without raising its voice. Those who stayed were protected. Those who led were replaced. The system corrected itself. As I closed that chapter, I understood something I hadn't before. Being essential doesn't mean being permanent. It means building something that lasts beyond you, even when your name no longer appears on doors, slides, or signatures that once carried weight. I was never irreplaceable. I was just never supposed to be fired. I didn't survive because I was loud, visible, or celebrated. I survived because I built things that worked when no one was watching systems, habits, decisions made quietly at the right time. That kind of work doesn't look impressive on a slide, but it holds when pressure hits. There were moments when my silence felt like weakness, even to me. Moments when being overlooked cut deeper than open criticism. But I've learned that restraint is not surrender. Sometimes it's preparation, sometimes it's dignity, and sometimes it's the only way to protect what matters without becoming the thing you're fighting against. What stayed with me most wasn't the fall of one person, but the stability of everyone else. People kept their jobs. The company kept moving. No one had to pay for someone else's arrogance. That's the kind of justice that doesn't cheer, but it lasts. If you're listening right now, I wonder, did you stay until the end because some part of this felt familiar? Have you ever been underestimated, dismissed, or quietly carrying more weight than anyone realized? If you're comfortable, I'd really like to hear your story, and tell me where you're listening from. I always imagine those places when I speak. If this resonated with you, consider leaving a comment, giving the video a like, or sharing it with someone who might need it. And if you want to stay with me for stories like this, subscribing helps more than you know, because sometimes the quietest journeys carry the strongest truths, and they're worth walking together.